It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Duncan Berryman. Duncan is based in the Department of Archaeology and Paleoecology at Queen's University Belfast, and he's worked on various aspects of medieval buildings, from barns to manors, as well as an edited volume on the buildings of medieval Europe. His paper today is entitled Lordly Buildings Among Peasants, Displays of Authority Within Manorial Centres. Over to you, Duncan.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present this paper to such an audience. Start sharing my screen. Okay. So the church was probably the most important institution in the medieval world. The teachings of the church, conveyed through the priest's sermons, impacted on the daily lives of peasants and lords alike. The other important institution was the manor, from which the peasants leased their land and to which they owed labour services. The lord had some control over the lives of his peasants through their leases and fines to the manor court. Both of these institutions were represented by large buildings within the manorial village. This paper will discuss how the buildings of the manorial farmstead, the curia, were designed and positioned to act as a display of the lord's wealth and their authority over the tenants of the village. As well as the agricultural buildings, we'll think about the relationship between the village, the church, and the curia to explore relationships between lord and villagers. This work draws on my recently completed PhD thesis and ongoing research into manorial agricultural buildings of the Middle Ages. So, the layout of the curia was an important part of the experience for those who entered it. There are a few excavated examples that show where the entrances were often surrounded by agricultural buildings. This is particularly evident at South Witham, an example here, where there were barns and animal houses to either side of the entrance. Barns this side and animal houses over here. There's also a large barn to the south of the entrance to the curia of Chalgrove. We can see here, the barn and the main entranceway, which probably had a bridge across the moat. While focused on Chalgrove, we can see that domestic buildings were grouped together to the north of the entrance, and the agricultural buildings formed a court to the south. The barns and animal houses of the curia were often the focus of the manor's agriculture. The tenants brought the harvest to these barns, and each day the animals were brought out of their houses and returned to them at night. Therefore, the tenants entered these buildings regularly, and in doing so were reminded of their labour services owed to the lord and the authority that the lord had over their lives. Nucleated villages were common across England, and the majority of case studies from my PhD fall into this category. Many nucleated villages were formed around greens or had common spaces at their core. This provided a communal space for the village to gather for fairs and markets, to temporarily house animals, and to give access to communal water supplies. Previous work by Brian E. McDonough on the Yorkshire Wolds has shown that over half of the villages had the manorial curia beside the parish church, either in the centre of the settlement or on the periphery. My case studies for my PhD reflect McDonough's figures, with just under half showing a close relationship between the curia and the church, while about 2/3 of these had buildings within or on the periphery of the settlements. Longbridge Deverill in Wiltshire provides a good example of a nucleated village with the church. Oh, there we go. With the church marked here in the blue, and the curia marked in red, located together at the edge of the village, and the tenements extended along the road. The only example from my case studies where the curia was in the middle of the settlement was at Wellow, which is there. Here, the curia was on the main roads through the village, and the church was located slightly further to the east. The church is here, and the manor site is there. There may have been a green to the east of the village adjacent to the churchyards. Some sites, such as Hinderclay, had the curia on the very edge of the settlement, with the church between the curia and the settlement. So here we've got the curia marked in red and the church marked in green there. It's possible that the curia was placed alongside an important road leading to the settlement. The road leading from the village to the fields is highlighted in yellow there. Similarly, at Old System, the curia and the church were located together and to the south of the linear settlement. They were both on main roads, main access routes through the village to the South Downs, where the livestock were taken for grazing. Many churches were located beside the curia on the periphery of the settlement, and most were between the curia and the settlement. You've seen at Longbridge, Deverell, Hinderclay, Woolstone, and Old System. Only Bircham here has a clear distance between the curia, the very edge of the settlement, and the church, which was the focus of the settlement to the south. These examples have shown the generally a close relationship between the curia and the church. Many of these churches will have been built on pre-existing sites, possibly predating the manorial curia. If this was the case, then the lords chose to build their manorial centre beside the parish church. They were directly associating their power of the lords of the village with the authority of the church and its control over the lives of the villagers. The manorial hall was an important building, being the location of the manorial court. The barn may also have been used for such meetings, and it too gained some importance, as can be seen by Langland's discussion of it in Piers Plowman. However, placing the manorial buildings beside the church would have emphasised the lord's authority over the peasants while they worked the land for the lord or attended mass at the church. As peasants approached the curia from the village, the church would have been the first building in sight, with the curia behind. This may have been a conscious decision by the lord when constructing the curia. Additional height of the church would have made the curia significantly more impressive and larger than any other group of buildings in the settlement. The church would have been the tallest building in the village, and the manorial barns and hall were larger than those of the peasants. It's likely, therefore, that the arrangement of the buildings was a deliberate choice by the lord to impose his power and authority over the peasants and ensure that they were evident. This was evident through the buildings that were more impressive than anything else in the village. Placing the curia at the edge of the village also meant that it was the first group of buildings encountered as someone approaching the settlement. Many curia appear to have been on the main route between the village and the arable fields and pasture. Thus, they would have been clearly visible as the tenants returned to the village after working in the fields or tending the animals. It is possible that the lords placed them here to serve as a reminder of this relationship. But they may have been placed here for a much more functional purpose. It would have been easier to bring carts loaded with crops straight into the curia and the barn at the edge of the village than have to manoeuvre them through the village. The curia appear to have a very functional layout, with the barns and housing for draft animals and the outer courtyard and the domestic buildings in the inner court. This meant that the mess and the damage of the carts and oxen and horses was confined to the outer courtyard and kept away from the domestic buildings and the cleaner areas of the curia. The size and materials of manorial buildings were also important. Displays of the lord's authority. Churches may have been the tallest buildings in the village, but barns and halls were significantly larger than peasant houses and other buildings of the village. We have some examples of medieval barns still extant in the English landscape. Particularly of note is Great Coxwell, Bredon, and Forchester. This table shows that barns were at least 4 times bigger than the typical peasant house. And the leases of St Paul's Cathedral provide the dimensions of a few halls, although many of them are in complete dimensions. But we can compare those with the average size of a peasant house, and again we see they're at least twice the size, and possibly even some were bigger than those. As noted earlier, the significant size made these buildings visible to all who approached. However, their appearance was also an important aspect. Many halls and barns were constructed from stone, which was a stark contrast to the timber framing used for the animal housing and the peasant buildings. In areas where stone was sparse, the hall and barn were usually timber framed but were roofed with tiles, either of stone or clay, or shingles rather than thatch. Alceston is a good example of where the hall was built of flint rubble and roofed with tiles, while the barn was timber framed, but it was also roofed with tiles, while the rest of the curia was timber framed and roofed with thatch. At Longbridge Deverill, a stone hall and stone barn were constructed at the start of the 14th century, and both of these were roofed with stone tiles, while the surrounding animal housing was timber framed. Another important building within the curia that represented lordly authority was the dovecot. Dovecots were large buildings for the size of the birds that they housed. They were also often constructed of stone. As the ownership of doves was a manorial privilege, the dovecot became target for poaching, like rabbit warrens and fish ponds. Therefore, the lords invested significant amounts of money in the construction of large stone buildings to protect their doves. Also, doves were expensive animals to keep, as they ate grain from the fields and could damage thatched roofs. Thus, they were usually only kept on manors where the lord was resident. Therefore, the presence of a dovecot also indicated that this was an important manor of the lord's estate, and increasing the prestige of the curia. The sight of doves leaving the dovecot, potentially eating the peasants' grain and damaging their thatch, would also have reminded tenants of the lord's authority over them and their possessions. A handful of curia are isolated from any settlement. This is particularly noticeable in the manor of Holderness, some of which were located in the salt marshes, and most were primarily agricultural. Two examples here where you can see the isolated manor with just arable fields surrounding it. These were often manors that specialised in a particular type of agriculture, such as sheep farming, thus placing them in the middle of an agricultural landscape rather than within a settlement, which was a logical choice. Some of these isolated curia were placed within parklands. Burstwick and Redgrave are good examples, as they both have substantial parks that were still visible in the landscape. Both of these manors had large curiae during the Middle Ages, with domestic complexes, multiple halls and chambers. These were also the manors of major lords. Redgrave was held by the abbot of Bury St Edmunds, and Burstwick was a royal manor visited by Edward II and Edward III. The curiae that were located within parks were important manorial centres where lords would have come to entertain their guests and participate in leisure activities such as hunting and hawking. Lydiard notes that the creation of parks was a significant impingement on the rights of tenants to cultivate land or graze their livestock. Emparkment of land, even demesne land, meant that it was no longer available for agriculture. Thus, the lord was sacrificing income from the estate to create a landscape designed for pleasure and entertainment. Richardson has discussed how kings, especially in the 14th century, liked to have parks that surrounded their residences and created a contrived approach to the main buildings. There were also connections between parkland and the Romance literature, such as Gawain's approach to Burstwick Castle, which is depicted in this illustration. The setting of the palace was important to the lord, as the appearance of the buildings as a visitor approached influenced their impression of the lord. The landscape was not just for the enjoyment of visitors. Edward III had added a balcony to the royal palace at Woodstock, so that his daughter Isabella could have a better view over the Woodstock Park. Recently, Helen Gardner have published discussions of Scullin's Hall in Richmond Castle, noting that the projecting balcony along the south wall overlooked the Swale Valley below the castle. These examples suggest that people in the Middle Ages had a similar concept of landscape as we do today, and a similar desire for it to be visible from the buildings, and a similar appreciation of the natural or created vistas. Burstwick was a royal manor that reflects these desires to have an enclosed park with banks and control of entrances. There's evidence of a building complex to the south of the park boundary, which is here, and the complex there. There's evidence of south of the current road to the hall complex passed to the east of a series of fish ponds, but the original path may have been to the west of the ponds and past the edge of the south park. It's possible that the inner park was designed as a setting for domestic buildings of Burstwick. So this would be, that's the modern road. It's likely that there's a path along this way, past the fish ponds, through the south park, and then eventually ended up at the central hall. It's likely that there's a similar approach to the forested approach to the Abbot of Bury St Edmund's curia of Redgrave. Curia was set far to the south of the settlement, and it's possible that it was approached through or beside what is now known as the nursery, but which is clearly a well-developed and wooded landscape. Again, settlement, the north, and the curia is down here to the south, but through this forest. Parish church was to the north of the manor, and a path crosses the more open landscape partly created by Capability Brown in the 18th century between the church and the curia. Both of these routes would have approached the hall, with the wooded area in front drawing parallels with the approach to Burstwick and Burstwick's castle and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Parks were places where the Lord could create a landscape within which they had a certain amount of privacy to perform pastimes such as hunting, but they were also a landscape to impress visitors, creating views that were reminiscent of literary passages associated with chivalry and lordship. It's clear from the evidence presented here that the position of the curia was important to the Lord. Many curia were integrated into the village, and many of these were closely associated with the parish church. This suggests that the Lord wished to display a close relationship with the tenants, and that they regularly entered the curia to carry out their customary works. It also allowed the Lord to make a powerful statement of his authority over the tenants, as these buildings were visible to the peasants throughout their everyday lives. The location of the church alongside the curia emphasised the relationship between the lordship and religion, and associated his authority with the influence of the church over their lives. The curia placed in parks were evidently intended to be more private places for the Lord to inhabit without seeing the houses of the peasants. These curia were surrounded by parkland and woodland. However, many of these did have agricultural buildings within them, indicating that they were also served as a manorial farm. Thus, despite the Lord's desire for isolation, the curia would still have had peasants entering and bringing livestock in carts into the outer yards. The inner yards were enclosed, possibly moated, and did provide some privacy from the more public outer yard. Even with this public aspect, it is still clear that this landscape was designed for the pleasure of the Lord and to impress his peers if they were to visit. The act of walking through the park to the curia would have clearly given the impression of the Lord's authority over any tenants entering. This authority would have been particularly evident in the presence of dovecots or warrens placed along the approach, emphasising the power of the Lord over the landscape and his tenants. The building of the manorial curia were larger than most of the other buildings within the village, thus they were immediately more imposing and visible to those within the village. The materials of the buildings were similar to those of the rest of the village, but the most important buildings were often identified with the use of masonry and tiles, distinguishing them from all other buildings. I hope that this paper has shown that the appearance of buildings of the manorial curia and their position within the village were designed to convey the authority of the Lord over those living in the surrounding houses. Size and materials were important in display, but buildings like dovecots were also a reminder of the Lord's privileges and authorities over his tenants. Thank you for your time, and if there's any questions, my contact details and question time now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. If you could come back to us, I'm sure there are some questions for you. There we go. So if anybody has a question, if you could unmute yourselves and make yourself visible on camera, then I'll know that you're ready to ask a question. I'm going to dive in first of all, Duncan. I have a naive question about dovecotes, as I realise I have a complete blank. What are they doing with the doves?
Mostly for food.
They are delicacies.
So the young doves, the squabs, would tend to be a delicacy. I'm presuming the eggs as well.
Swab pigeons, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Quite simple. I thought to double check there wasn't like another reason they're just eating them.
Don't think so.
My other thought about the dovecotes is I was just wondering, do you know of any timber examples? So I was thinking that their feces is quite degrading, and that I don't know if actually it's partly a practical. I take your point about it being a prestige thing to build them out of stone, but I was wondering if it was also partly practical, because if you've got all these doves defecating everywhere, it's going to deteriorate really quickly if it's made of timber.
There are timber examples. It's just they don't survive. And the ones that we do have are post-medieval, but I think they tend to be square.
Okay.
Certainly the surviving timber examples. But no, they were quite common, but it's just the stone ones that we have much more archaeological evidence for.
Do you think it's significant that the stone ones are circular?
You do get square stone ones as well. There's all systems dovecot is mostly square. I think it makes it a lot easier to build it, and then easier to access them. Because not sure now in the 14th century, but sort of later you get the ladder in the middle that rotates to make it easier. You go up and you pick the doves out. So I don't know if we have any evidence for that in the 14th century, but certainly not long afterwards. That's appearing. So that certainly is an easier method and a reason to be circular.
Mm-hmm. I was curious. That's my dovecot questions. I have more lofty questions regarding to the churches. I kind of get to see a lot the idea that that's their rightful place being next to the church, and I get that kind of assumed authority they're trying to get. And I just wonder if the examples you've looked at, do you see examples of the curia themselves having their own chapels, or are you envisaging these lords going to the parish church along with the hoi polloi?
Some of them are hard to tell. All systems probably one of the ones I've looked at most closely for the village and the landscape aspect of it. And there, it's very difficult to know if the manorial accounts talk about the chapel, but it's hard to know whether the chapel and the church are the same in that case. And I think at Chalgrove, there's evidence that there was a small chapel within the domestic complex, I think it's over the kitchen. So certainly within the chambers of the domestic complex, one of those rooms was a chapel. Mm-hmm. So the accounts all reference a chapel generally. So it's likely that most of the manors had a chapel of some description as well as the village parish church.
I just wondered if you had any separate evidence for these, or relying on the documents.
Yeah, there's not very many excavated examples we have, so.
Richard, I think I saw you were unmuting yourself. However, Lindy's beating you to it, so.
Right.
Oh no, you're speaking. Well, Richard, would you like to go first because you're unmuted?
Okay. Is there a difference between the sort of the curia complexes where there's no resident lord of the manor, where perhaps it's owned by a monastery or another institution or the king or whatever? Do the same sort of ideas hold? Because obviously they're still manorial in the sense of having courts and things run by a reeve or whatever.
Probably a lot of them are. the examples like in Holderness, I showed where near Burstwick is the central manor, and it's got all the near the settlement, although it's within the parkland. Whereas it's the other manors in the Holderness estate are in the salt marshes and isolated, so they are quite separate. I'm probably not sure whether they had many tenants. So I haven't looked at the tenant lists, the rent rules for those ones. But it could be that they've got quite a few tenants within them. I would say probably most of them, if they're within a settlement, would conform. You'd find that places where the lords aren't resident, you don't get dovecots, and probably get fewer chambers, and the domestic complex was probably a lot more limited. But most places would have a hall and agricultural buildings. So that the curia may have looked a little bit different in those cases, but probably if they have tenants and a reasonable number of properties, they probably are following similar ideas within the settlement.
Yeah, it probably will always come down to money, how valuable the whole thing is, and how much money there is available for architectural sort of grandioseness.
Yes.
Right, Lindy?
Thank you. Actually, Richard has more or less asked my question, and but can I first of all say your cat is wonderful?
I wasn't sure if anyone could see that.
Yes, no, your cat, bit of a star. But Duncan, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Like Richard, I wondered, how much, whether you felt there was a real difference between the layout between courts that were run by ecclesiastical institutions and courts that were run by secular lords, and I wondered, picking up on what Harriet had asked about the a chapel within the court itself, and I wondered how that would work where you're dealing with effectively a monastic curia. And I'm very conscious of this in France, because if you want some nice French examples where you've got some documentation, though you probably haven't got the buildings, Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis in his book on his administration talks a lot about building a court here and a curia there, and he sometimes tells you about some of the buildings in them, and you might find it quite useful. I think one of them, the chamber falls, it's a two-level chamber, and it collapses, breaking a whole load of wine in the cellar underneath. But you might find that there is sort of material there to have a look at. But I just wondered, if they're monastic cells, they'll have a sort of quite substantial, in France they would have a very substantial integral, if you like, chapel, possibly a priory, and the I would guess that the villagers would use the nave as their parish church, but I don't know.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I haven't looked at so places like Glastonbury and that where you have agricultural buildings beside the monastery as such. I haven't really looked into that. So mine
but
are.
I'm thinking about the monastic, the various small priories or cells that they have all around the place, and mentioned a couple of those.
Yeah, so places like Alceston belongs to Battle Abbey. So it's detached, and we know that the monks and the prior visited quite often. So yeah, that's what we say. We know it's got a chapel, but whether that chapel is also was the parish church, possibly. They would, a lot of them would tend to probably be the same as the example. I gave at the beginning of South Witham is a Templar preceptory, and it's got quite a large church complex. It's got a big domestic hall and then a big church complex to the south, all enclosed and possibly a two-floor or a balcony within the church. So it's obviously got quite a large chapel provision for the brothers of the order that were there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else have a question for Duncan? All right, I just have one more question about the churches. Where'd it go? I just wonder if you talk a little bit about the documents that support them. So I would assume that the curia, once they establish themselves in the area, they would start bestowing stuff on the church and strengthening the link. And I was just wondering if you can confirm that that is the case in all the ones you've looked at, that there's a strong documentary link and financial link as well.
I haven't seen a link, or certainly in the accounts, the manorial accounts, there's no payments to the church. They spend money on the chapels, but not to the parish church. Now, whether that's actually the Lord that establishes the church, the money is coming from the central state funds or somewhere else. But as far as I know, it's not coming from the manorial income.
That's interesting.
Not that I can think of anyway off the top of my head.
Finally, Duncan, then I just want to ask you whether your research is being put out at any point. Is it working towards publication somehow, that we can read more about it and cite you?
Yes, I'm working on bits and pieces at the minute. I should. My blog, medievalbuildings.wordpress.com, has updates and links to my academia page where papers will be published. Hopefully, eventually, a book will appear, but that's in progress.
Yes, you're in the postdoc wastelands. That's what happens.
Yep.
No worries. Well, thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. Round of applause. Thank you very much.